Today's the second day of dealing with the quadratic formula, and I want to review just a couple basics. First, what is the quadratic formula? You should have this memorized, or it should be in the process of being memorized. It's negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And we should clarify that that's based on the polynomial being written in standard form. So ax squared plus bx plus c, right? So your a, your b, and your c are the a's, the b's, and the c's in the quadratic formula. That's what it is. Why do we need it? Well, you need it because there's lots of times when you need to solve a quadratic equation, but you can't factor, you don't want to graph, perhaps you don't like completing the square. So the quadratic formula is a strategy that you can use. When are you allowed to use it? Heck, you can use it anytime you want. Now, if you have a teacher that's specifically saying use graphing or use completing the square and so on, then you have to use those techniques. But as you move into Algebra 2 from Algebra 1, you're going to find that the teachers are going to be more interested in you solving successfully using a good strategy and less requirement upon one particular technique, right? They're going to assume that you have lots of techniques and that you're going to be allowed to choose the most appropriate one. So there are some students that will use the quadratic formula most of the time, and that's fine. And then finally, what's the discriminant? The discriminant is this piece or the value that ends up inside of your square root symbol. We can imagine that it's just the b value squared minus 4 times the a value times the c value. And it's just a numeric value. But because it is inside of a square root, it means a couple things. First, if your discriminant is greater than 0, which simply means it's positive, I'm allowed to take the square root of a positive number. And if I do take the square root of a positive number, I'm going to get two solutions. I'm going to get a positive solution, and I'm going to get a negative solution. If I have a discriminant that is equal to 0, I'm going to have the square root of 0. And the only thing that can multiply by itself to give 0 is 0. So you're going to have exactly one solution, because though there is a plus or a minus in front of this, plus 0 and minus 0 really impact the problem exactly the same way. They don't really impact it at all. And if you have a discriminant that is less than 0, which would be negative, then what we'll say is that you have no real solutions. One more time, there are solutions. They might be negative, they might be imaginary, but if you see a negative at this point in time, this is what the discriminant does for us. And you have to calculate the discriminant anyway, so doing it first is usually a good strategy because you might get lucky, and by lucky I mean you might find that there are no real solutions, in which case you don't have to continue on with the rest of the problem. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and look at one example. It's this guy right here. You're going to see some Get More Math examples today. They all look basically like this. You're going to have your calculator available. I'm going to go ahead and get my calculator ready to roll as well. And I'll half screen it here and we'll see what we do. So first, what's the discriminant? Well, it's b squared minus 4ac. So in my particular example, that's going to be 6 squared minus 4 times a times c. Now, only because I happen to be here with my calculator, I'm going to do 36, because that's 6 squared, minus 4 times 3, and I already think this is going to give me a negative answer, so perhaps this isn't the best example. Look at this. So we get negative 60. So this is worth kind of playing out, right? So what's the discriminant? The discriminant would be negative 60. How many solutions? There are no solutions. And then solve for x, you just write no solution again. Or you might write no solutions exist, something like that. So while that's a good example for a no solution problem, it's probably not the greatest example for what other examples are out there. So let's go ahead and, well, modify this ever so slightly. You can, of course, go back and rewatch that part. I'm going to take this part out, this part out, this part out. So this is now example number 2. 0 is 2x squared plus 4x plus 2. Now, what's the discriminant? We're still going to do the discriminant first. So we're going to go b squared, so 4 squared minus 4 times a times c. So I'm going to get 16 minus, well, 4 times 2 is 8. 8 times 2 is 16. Look at this one. So this time you end up with a 0 in there. So the discriminant is 0. How many solutions? one solution. Okay, so let's go ahead and solve for x. So when we decide to solve for x, whether you have one solution or two solutions, you still have to go through the procedure. So now we're going to go ahead and use the entire quadratic formula. So x is negative b plus or minus the square root of, now we already figured this part out, right? It's normally b squared minus 4ac, but we did that part already, and we determined that that's 0. So I'm going to, well, not cheat, I'm just going to use my resources. I'm going to put a 0 in there, and this will be over 2a. So you realize that once you use the discriminant, life gets pretty good. So we have x is negative b, so my b is 4, so negative 4 plus or minus, now the square root of 0 is just 0, over 2 times a. Now a is, in this problem, is right here. A is 2, so 2 times 2. So here's what I have. Negative 4 plus or minus 0 is just negative 4. This is over 4, and we get negative 1, right? So we only expected one solution because the discriminant was equal to 0, and our solution is x is negative 1. That's what you would type in. Now, for those of you Get More Math people out there, I do want to do one last example. Since we've come up with an example of no solution, we've come up with an example of one solution, and now we're going to get to an example of, you could probably guess, two solutions. Let's go ahead and deal with the discriminant first, because that big D, or the discriminant, is a good way to go. So b squared minus 4ac, so I'm going to go 16 squared minus 4 times a times c. Now, if the numbers get kind of big, don't be scared to use a calculator. 16 squared is 256. And watch this, right? There's lots of negatives going on here, so I'm going to type each one of them in. Negative 4, oops, I don't need the previous answer. So negative 4 times negative 4 times negative 15. I have all my negatives in there, and I get, negative 240. And that's okay, because when I subtract these, I'm going to get 16. 16 is positive, so I'm going to have, so by the way, there's my discriminant. How many solutions? 2 solutions. All right, so we have 2 answers to 2 different questions. And now let's go ahead and solve for x, rounding to the nearest hundredth as we go. So negative b plus or minus the square root of, our discriminant was 16, so we're going to put that in there, over 2 times a, right? That's x equals. So x is negative b, there's my b value, so negative 16 plus or minus. Now, I'm going to do the square root of 16, and that equals 4, so I'm going to leave that sit there. 2a, my a value is the negative 4, so I'm going to do 2 times negative 4 and get negative 8. So here we go. I don't need this calculator anymore. I'm going to go ahead and do negative 16 plus 4 over negative 8. And I'm going to do negative 16 minus 4 over negative 8, right? Because we had 2 choices, so we have to represent both. Over here, I get negative 12 over negative 8. That's going to be 1.5. And over here, I get negative 20 over negative 8, which is 2.5. Now, Get More Math, you know, is particular about how they want their answers. So here's how you're going to write your answer. When you go to type your answer in, you're going to type x equals 1.5 or x equals 2.5. We're going to use the word or. You're going to make sure you write 2 different equations separated by the word or. It's or because the zero product property tells you one or the other has to be 0. They could both be 0 in the zero product property, but they don't need to be. So that's why we use the or statement in there. So a typical question will ask you, what's the discriminant, how many solutions, and what are those solutions?